Now that we've got a page on which we can view our entity, and we've seen how you can add fields to an entity, I want to take a look at adding some additional view modes. You've probably seen view modes before. And the most common use case is the difference between a full page node and a teaser of a node. And that ability to configure fields and their displays so that some fields only appear in the teaser and others only appear in the full view. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at adding 2 custom view modes to our video entity. And then we're going to modify our build content method on the controller in order to make use of these 2 new view modes and modify what people see on the screen depending on which view mode is being used. So let's go ahead and get started with that. Just to illustrate what it is that we're trying to accomplish in this lesson, let's take a quick look at how the node system deals with view modes. If you go to Structure and then Content Types, and you go to Manage Fields for one of your existing content types, you can see up here on the top right that there is this default and teaser being a view mode here. And I can also open up custom display settings and see a handful of other view modes. These are all view modes that are defined by the node entity controller. Full content, teaser, RSS, and so forth. The default is sort of a system where the view modes will use the settings for the default view mode if you've not specified custom settings for that view mode. So in this instance, I have custom settings for my teaser view mode that say display this set of fields, and then I have the default settings. Whenever one of the other view modes is specified, say by views or panels or display suite or some other module that displays things using view modes, if it specifies the RSS view mode, it's just going to default to whatever set in the default settings here. This is important, as we'll see in the code, we can determine some information about how these custom settings work. If we go to our Videos tab and click on Manage Display for our video entity, you'll see that we don't have any view modes currently. So what I'd like to do is add some view modes. The first thing to look at is the documentation for hook entity info. In the documentation for the function, there is a description of the view modes key and how we can make use of it. If you scroll down the page here, you'll see view modes, and it says view modes is a key that you can add to your array in hook entity info, and you can define any number of different view modes. The key of the view modes array is the machine readable name of your view mode, and then you can give it a label, a human readable name, and you can decide whether or not the custom settings should be forced or only used if somebody has explicitly set custom settings, otherwise use the default. And that's what we just looked at when we were looking at the settings for our node content types. So I can make use of this by switching to my code. And in our hook entity info implementation, video entity underscore entity info, I'm going to update the array of information that's returned for our video entity. And I'll just keep tacking additional information onto the end here. And we'll say custom view modes. And I'm actually going to add 2 of them. I'm going to add a non-member view mode, like so. And I just need to give it a label. Remember that the label here is the human readable label of the view mode that's used in the UI. And then the string non-member, this key of the array here, is what will be used in our controller when we're responding to certain view modes being requested. For both of these, I'm going to say custom settings false. And we'll copy this and create a second view mode, which we'll call member. So now we've got 2 view modes that we can use in our site. And although Drupal won't make use of these by itself, We're exposing these so things like views, for example, can request this entity to be rendered using a specific view mode. All I need to do is save that. So I've got a non-member and a member view mode. If I go back to my site, I need to clear the cache first so that these show up. I'll clear all caches. So now, back on our Manage Display tab, I can see under Custom Display Settings, I've got our two new view modes. And I can go ahead and enable one of those so that I can set custom settings for it. We'll enable the member one, for example, and say Save. So now we've got the default settings that will be used whenever we've not specified our own custom settings for a particular view mode. And we've got the settings for the member view mode. And we could do something like, say, in the member view mode, let's render the category as plain text instead of as a link. And we'll go ahead and save that. Now, whenever somebody views one of our video entities in the member view mode, the category field will be rendered differently. But how do we make use of that in our code? Let's say, for example, I'm going and viewing a particular video. Right now, I'm seeing the video in, well, what view mode? What view mode am I seeing it in here? To know that, we got to look at our code. If we go back to our code and we look at the page callback that displays our video entity, which is this one right here, video entity view entity, and then we call this function entity underscore view, which loads the controller and goes through the whole process of turning our entity into a renderable array. It takes a third argument here to this function, which we haven't specified yet, and that's view mode. So I could right here specify a view mode. So what if I set this to non-member? But I still need to make some adjustments so that our entity actually uses that when it's rendering this entity into a renderable array. So over in our controller, we've got our build content method from earlier when we added the duration in the embed code to the renderable output. You'll see here, one of the arguments that this function takes is view mode. Now, the default that's usually used is full. However, ours now should be either non-member or member because those are the view modes that our entity provides. Let's change this to be non-member by default. And that's what we just passed in the previous function as well. Now, in my build content method, I can make use of this to determine how to display things differently depending on the view mode when it comes to properties. An example of that might be something like displaying the embed code with an iframe and you can view the video if the user is a member, but only display a link to the video on YouTube if they're a non-member. So the code to do that looks something like this. Inside of my build content method, I'm checking the view mode parameter to see whether it's set to member or non-member. And if it is set to member, I'm showing the iframe that we had before. And if it's not set to member, I'm going to show just an embed code link. So you see a link rendered that says link to YouTube and it links someone to the actual video. So now if I save that and I switch back to our site and I refresh the page, it looks totally different. I get the link now instead of the full rendered video. And that's because in the function that we used to render the entity for display in our callback function, we specified, let's use the non-member view mode. I could go and change that back and say member instead, like so. And if I refresh, now I'll get what I saw before, which is the video rendered and the member view mode for this video entity. View modes are really, really useful when it starts to come to displaying your entities in other contexts. Views, for example, has the ability to make use of a view mode. When you've decided to output the entities that you just got a list of from the database using the entity render output style, you can choose a view mode. Would you like it to be member or non-member? In this scenario, we could also add some additional functionality to our controller that said, when this controller is loaded, check a permission and see if the user should be treated as a member or a non-member, and then set the view mode accordingly. Once you understand how to set and create your own view modes, it opens up a lot of possibilities for how your entities can interact with other modules in the way that they'd like to display content.